Hi, my name's Phil. I like to talk about politics, and in this video, I'd like to discuss how the four largest parties played this first PMQs under a Starmer government today and what it might mean for the immediate future. And just to be clear, I'm not going to run down the main questions asked, and would you believe it, actually sort of answered for a change, though I will, of course, pick a few examples. But I said before the election, look, I'm not going to do PMQs videos regularly now. Not doing it. All right, just this once. And that's because it's a fairly toothless affair for quite a while now. I said I didn't originally do regular PMQs videos. I sort of then started doing them when the Starmer Johnson showdown began, and I sort of got trapped into it. But there is no point now because the point of PMQs is to allow MPs to hold the Prime Minister to account on a generally weekly basis with a more in-depth level of scrutiny from the liaison committee, which only questions him or her once in a blue moon. But what does scrutiny of the Prime Minister mean in the case of PMQs? It can only mean challenging or maybe praising the government on its work so far or querying the wisdom of planned moves for the future. Well, Starmer has been Prime Minister for less than 3 weeks. His government have made a lot of moves. It's all been very active, but there's no record to challenge or praise. It's all hypothetical. We don't suddenly have a load more houses or wind farms or better agreements with the EU or water companies behaving themselves or shorter NHS waiting lists. We sure as the hell don't have the small boats issue in decline. And a lot of the real action will come as a result of primary legislation. And Parliament has only just finished debating the King's Speech. So that process is only beginning really today. So all MPs who wish to scrutinise the Prime Minister have got left is to argue about the hypothetical consequences for their policies for the future. But they've spent the entire election campaign doing this. It's now boring. If you repeat the same arguments, you're no doubt going to be... that is going to be a feature of the coming months, but it's why I'm not going to bother doing regular videos. We've already had those arguments. We just need to wait for the impacts now. So I will only cover it when something really interesting pops up, just as I used to in 2019 when I started building the channel. I only started, as I say, doing these PMQs regularly because I thought Starmer Johnson, that could be interesting. It did. It got very interesting with Boris Johnson ending up being called out as a massive liar. So that was good. But I'm breaking from the orbit now. But the way the four main leaders approached PMQs today was interesting. Much more interesting, really, what I mean is the three big leaders of the opposition parties, because Starmer as Prime Minister now is largely just reacting. And it tells us a lot about how they intend to proceed in this Parliament. So first of all, I'm going to express disappointment with Starmer. I said that regardless of what Sunak asked him, doesn't matter what he asked him, his first response should have begun with, yes, now you get to ask the questions. He didn't do this. Disappointed. Maybe Starmer thought it wouldn't have been in the best taste given that Sunak didn't actually ask any aggressive questions at all and made a point of saying he wasn't going to. Sunak actually said, look, I'm going to ask about areas of shared interest, where Labour have made a point of being supportive of our government, national security in Ukraine, right? In fact, to watch PMQs today, you might be forgiven for thinking we had a normal parliament and that Rishi Sunak was a decent, genuine politician trying to raise important issues in a way which seeks consensus and only challenging where he doesn't get it. It's a shame he wasn't like this as Prime Minister because that's a pretty good way to do government. Attempt to get consensus. OK, if you don't get it, you don't get it. You've got the power to ignore it, but attempt to. I know it's easy for me to say his party would have stood a much better chance if he had led a government of integrity as he promised, but I think it's safe to say he could hardly have done much worse. I did actually see someone comment that Sunak's getting it all backwards here. His more pleasant and cooperative manner as leader of the opposition would have worked better as Prime Minister, and his more in-your-face combative approach as Prime Minister would have worked better leading the opposition. This may be true. But I think Sunak's behaviour then and now can also be explained by circumstances. As Prime Minister, he was constantly having to keep the loony wing of his party on side because he overestimated their strength. He was battling his own side more than Labour. I believe he could have faced them down. I think he had the will within his parliamentary party to do so. I think the Windsor framework showed that. I just don't think he was adept or strong enough to do it. Whereas now, what's the point? The Conservative Party are going to choose a particular direction to travel in, as they seek to rebuild. Not only will it not be up to Sunak to decide what that direction is, he can't know which argument's going to win out in the end. So it doesn't make sense for Sunak to start pushing a particular line aggressively, only for his successor to have to do an about-face. That will just make the party look divided again. So Sunak's tone today made strategic sense in the interests of his party. It doesn't mean he will spend the next few months just covering areas of agreement with Labour. There are policy areas where the Conservatives are in agreement and opposed to Labour. He can safely have a pop at VAT on private school fees, immigration in general terms, although he might be wise to not talk about the Rwanda plan. He can go on about capital gains tax if he wants. He can have a pop at the GB Energy project or nationalisation of the railways. All of these things would allow Sunak to oppose Starmer in a way he knows his successor would definitely approve, and therefore not create a jolt in policy direction once the new leader, whoever that ends up being, is elected in November. But it no longer makes sense for Sunak to be combative. He's not going to lead them into any election campaigns, not even next year's local elections. So there's no point in trying to be in campaign mode. He also doesn't particularly have to keep his party together. They can probably rely upon to do that themselves or not over the next few months. Nothing he says is going to change that. We might actually get a way more respectful tone in PMQs, at least until autumn at any rate. From that point on, it depends whether the Tories decide to elect someone sensible or a populist. But before we move on to the Lib Dems, I am just going to say there was one line from Sunak which I thought curious, just sort of popped out to me. So as he was talking about Ukraine, and Starmer could have had another dig there as well, but he didn't. It was all very pleasant. So Sunak talked about Russian sanctions and he called for Starmer to go further. And my first thought was, well, why didn't you go further there? If you think there's scope to go further, you were Prime Minister like a month ago. Why didn't you go further? Then I wondered if Sunak wanted to, but knew that Putin's claws grip deeply into his party, and that maybe he is genuinely hoping that Labour really do something to remove the Kremlin's grip from our politics. Or am I reading too much into it, hoping that because Sunak has decided to adopt a sort of more civil tone, that maybe he's a fundamentally more decent chap than his behaviour over the last few years, including, remember, his callous time as Chancellor in 2020 would suggest. But then there was the approach taken by Ed Davey of the Lib Dems. Very interesting. In fact, were it not for this, I wouldn't have done this video at all. But it also makes sense. He was straight in, acknowledging the hideous mess that the Tories had left Labour to clear up, echoing Labour's own lines, before pressing Starmer on, first of all, the injustice in the carers allowance scheme, and then more generally on the NHS. Now, pressing Labour on something important, which the new government haven't committed to, so this is definitely taking on the job of opposing the government, or at least trying to pressure them into movement, but also making it clear that the cause of the problem is the Tories. And this makes strategic sense for the Lib Dems and counterpoints with the SNP approach as well. So the Lib Dems will want to not only hold on to the massive haul of seats won earlier this month, they will want to build on that if the Tories would be so kind as to carry on being useless in opposition, which I still think has a better than evens odds right now. And that requires the Lib Dems to be seen as a powerful voice in Parliament. The best way they can do this is by pressuring for actual changes. I mean, it's one thing to say, oh, we're raising the profile of this policy. We are the voice. Right, okay, voice, fine, okay. If you can actually get changes or be seen to nudge the government into a better direction, that's practical. That's useful. You know, if you decide to do that by pressuring for changes from Labour that are sort of in alignment with what they would like anyway, it's just not their priority. And Davies' questions on social care and the NHS, really good line to take. If they can claim they have nudged Labour towards better outcomes, that's a good case for continuing to vote Lib Dem. And in terms of electoral strategy, remember the Lib Dems don't actually compete with Labour. They compete with the Conservatives, almost all seats. So it works in the Lib Dems' political interest to be the party of constructive opposition and to pick policies to champion where there is crossover with Labour. Incidentally, I will just point out that Starmer talked in general terms about the need to address the problems Davey raised without actually agreeing to do any of the things Davey suggested. So there is scope for the Lib Dems to press this. The SNP, of course, chose to bring up the two-child cap again. I discussed a lot of the issues there in a video earlier, so I'm not going to repeat that. But the SNP in a very different position to the Lib Dems. Their main competition is Labour. Ideologically, it's more the Tories, but in terms of electoral strategy, it's Labour. It's always been Labour. Even when Labour were all but wiped out in Scotland at the last election, it was still competing with Labour in most of those seats. And in answer to the SNP question, Starmer did thank Flynn for bringing up Gordon Brown, who was featuring on a newspaper used as a prop, which you're not supposed to use. He got told off, but never mind. Starmer reminded people that Brown lifted millions of children out of poverty and his government would be going at the same issue with the same vigour. And that is how Labour will ultimately be judged on the states, in this case of child poverty, once they've had time to actually get a budget implemented. Because everyone agrees that the short-term start to the problem is better use of funding. But the SNP, here we can see, are going to play the role of fiery opposition. It'll be quite an interesting dynamic going forward to consider the lines each of the four main parties takes when considering their electoral strategies. The Lib Dems don't need to oppose Labour for the sake of it because they're competing with the Conservatives in the election. But they will want to show they can achieve things, so working on realistic nudges will be the way to go, because they need to say to people, you're better off with a Labour government but a Lib Dem opposition nudging them into better outcomes than to have a Conservative government. The Conservatives and the SNP directly compete with each other, but mostly with Labour. And so they will provide the fire and brimstone style opposition, which will be more exciting to talk about, but probably won't achieve anything because they need to show voters that Labour won't implement what they want. So only replacing them with an SNP or Tory MP will do the trick, which I think sets the scenes for what we can expect this Parliament. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe for further content and click the like button. You can also sign up for memberships if you'd like to support the channel further. Thanks for watching, and until next time, I'll see you later.